This last year has been absolutely insane. I've worked on a lot of crazy prop builds, added some new members to my droid squad, and had the opportunity to try out a bunch of awesome new tech, which is what we're going to be talking about today. I always get comments asking how I'm getting along with certain 3D printers now that I've had the chance to use them for X amount of months, and I thought it might be beneficial for everyone if I sat down and gave updates on the machines and also compared them to each other and talk a bit about what I like and dislike about certain printers. Thankfully, there are a ton of great 3D printer options on the market these days, but the absolute perfect 3D printer for someone will differ from person to person depending on the types of projects they're interested in making. I've accidentally turned into a bit of a 3D printer whisper amongst some of my friends that are also interested in the hobby. It's very flattering that they come to me seeking my advice, but I can also tell you that they have all ended up with completely different 3D printers. So that's one real life example of how there is a different perfect 3D printer out there for everyone. So whether you're someone that's looking into purchasing their very first 3D printer or are somebody that's looking at upgrading to a new machine, hopefully this video will be helpful and informative for you as we discuss a pretty decent variety of some of the machines available today. Before we get started, I am going to be sticking to the FDM 3D printer side of things for this video. That tends to be the far more confusing and saturated side of the 3D printing market, and I also feel like there are generally a lot more differences between FDM machines than there are resin printers. And second, some of these machines were sent to me, some of them I bought myself, but you know how I run things around here. I never hold back from criticism, and I always just want to give you all a fair look at what these machines are capable of creating. I figured the best way to approach this video would be to group the machines by brand and keep the discussions more focused on those printers. I'm still probably going to be mentioning other printers for comparison's sake that I may or may not have already talked about in this video, but I am going to try and keep the discussions like as linear as possible so it doesn't get too confusing. We're going to start off with the QIDI printers. This includes the Q1 Pro, the X Plus 3, and the X Max 3. All of these QIDI printers are seriously the workhorses in my shop. They just really suit the types of projects that I'm personally typically working on. They are all enclosed printers and they all have active chamber heating, which is not something that you see in very many enclosed machines. I am sort of grouping them all together because honestly, they are all quite similar. They all have the same great print quality in my opinion. The X Max 3 and X Plus 3 are the most similar. They're sort of like in the same era of printer. The Q1 Pro is newer. The X Plus 3 and X Max 3, even though they physically have a different appearance from the outside, they basically are all the same on the inside, and all of like the specs are the same, the types of nozzles and, you know, all its innards are like identical, just at a larger scale for the X Max 3. The X Plus 3 is actually the printer that I've used the most out of the three. It is the one that I've had the longest, and I ended up loving it so much when I initially got it that I bought the X Max 3 because I really wanted that larger build volume. I'm obviously typically building life-size props, huge droids, so having a larger printer that's enclosed that I'm able to print droid pieces in ABS and not have to split up helmets and all of that good stuff is game-changing. It's meant that I've been able to pull off all of these crazy projects in not a crazy amount of time. The QIDI printers are why I was able to get my B1 battle droid completely finished in 2 weeks. The 3 printers got him entirely printed over 4 days, and then because they were ABS, they were a whole lot easier to post-process. So yeah, literally from the printing stage to fully finishing the droid, 2 weeks. Which yeah, is an insane timeline. Do not recommend building your droids that fast because I definitely lost sleep here and there. But even just at a less intense scale, being able to use these machines and print ABS props on them is really why this channel can function and I can create all of these crazy props week after week after week and not be absolutely losing my mind. The one thing with these machines is I wish they were more cubed size. They're all a cube build plate and then not quite the same height, and that is why I can never remember their exact sizing. So I will put their exact build volumes here, and that is also the one area where I start to see not being able to quite fit certain pieces on them. There have been very few pieces that I've not managed to fit on the build plate itself, it's the height where it's like all of a sudden too tall to fit in the printer. Still though, being able to have a fully enclosed machine at a 325-ish size is incredible. It does fit the majority of pieces that I'm looking at printing, and where it doesn't, I've managed to come up with solutions that it hasn't been that big of a deal. For instance, the latest thing that I printed, I did all of my armor pieces on my X Max 3 in ASA. They turned out really awesome. Did have to break up the chest plate just because my torso is larger than that build plate, but it is also just in general an absolutely massive piece of armor. The X Max and X Plus's case, it has auto bed leveling, but it does want you to manually set the Z offset, which to me is not a massive deal. In fact, I almost prefer it, and I will get into why in a second. But like, you would think the world was ending with some of the comments that I got when people found this out. And while yes, there are plenty of printers on the market these days that have automatic Z offset, and it can be very useful in a beginner's case because someone that's never touched a 3D printer in their life is not going to know like the ideal resistance on a card that you would put under a nozzle, or what even the machine is trying to tell you to do. So I like completely understand the benefit of having automatic Z offset, or Z offset for all the Americans that are about to be in my comment section giving me an earful. But the one thing with the machines that have the automatic Z offset is there tends to be nowhere where you can change it if it is not calculated to your personal preference, or is also possibly not calculated as accurately as it should be. So on the QIDI printers, not only can you set it to your desired height, but there's also just generally actual micro-stepping options on the interface of the machine. So if you go to print something and it doesn't seem to be sticking to your bed as much as it should, or it's sticking to the bed too much, you can very easily just change that Z offset, no issue. Which on the Bambu printers, the Creality ones, if you found that the Z offset was maybe too tight, you have no way to adjust that until you go into the slicer settings, and it's kind of a hidden feature. Not very convenient if things start not going great. I really wish across the board, any of the machines that have all of these automatic settings and stuff, that there would be a toggle almost like most slicers have, that you could turn it on and it has like advanced settings, and it would get rid of some of the presets or like add more options for like manual control. Because that is one of the things that really starts to annoy me, and I'm sure I'm gonna keep mentioning it at different parts in this video, just how little manual control you can have for certain aspects. And like I said, I fully understand that it is to simplify things as much as possible so that beginners aren't overwhelmed by all of these settings, and I think it is great that different things are automated now, but there really should be something that if you are someone that does know what you're doing with a 3D printer, then you should be able to manually adjust the various aspects. Sorry for the tangent there. Back to the QIDI printers. In terms of other features, the Q1 Pro does come with a camera. The X Max and X Plus don't, but you can purchase the same camera that is in the Q1 Pro for those, which I did do for my X Max 3, and it works great. It was super simple. You pretty much just tighten one screw to install the camera in the corner of the machine, run the USB cable through into the back, and plug it in. Camera quality is pretty decent. I have no issue seeing a live feed of the printer when I want to check in on it. I'm not actually sure if I would consider these machines beginner printers. It's not that they're particularly difficult to use, because they are very much plug and play. Because they're fully enclosed, they have almost no setup required. I mean it more that these machines are so capable of printing so many things. They're like on the edge of being an industrial printer pretty much. Especially with that active chamber heating, you really can print like anything that you want to. And so in that regard, they're almost overkill for a beginner. Like, I don't think anyone that's starting out with 3D printing should be going from I've never used a machine to let's print some carbon fiber nylon. The Q1 Pro is marketed as being more of that beginner friendly type of printer, and it is definitely very easy to use. It is the newer of the three, so it has some more automatic features. On the software side of things, QIDI's own slicer does actually work quite well. I used it for many months when I was first starting out with my X Plus and X X-Max. It is basically just a reskinned version of a Prusa slicer, which is pretty typical for all of the various brands slicers. They're reskinned versions of something, except most of the brand slicers that I have tried are pretty much non-functional, so points go to QIDI for it actually working. Their own slicer does work, but I have since switched to using Orca Slicer, which there does seem to be a lot of support behind Orca Slicer from QIDI. They've made their own machine printer profiles available through it. Orca is kind of like the every other printer clone of Bambu Studio, and Bambu Studio is also based off of Prusa Slicer. It's all the circle of printer life, apparently. But Orca just has a lot of features that I appreciate and use very frequently that are not available on a lot of other slicers. It is just so much easier for my own brain's sake if I only have to focus on one or two different slicers and knowing where all of the various settings are in those programs instead of having to try and figure out and remember 5 different programs for all of the different machines that I own. Orca just in general seems to be a very reliable slicer. I've never had it produce bad prints that I know are the slicer's fault, which is not the case in some slicers, which we will get into. The only other things that I could really make a comment on, I don't want to call it a complaint because it kind of doesn't really bother me. It's like a non-issue, but I did want to just mention it. They do all sort of have the spool holder on the back of the machine. The Q1 Pro, it's kind of like on the back, but it like hangs out on the side. And I do bring this up frequently, like I understand why they put it on the back from every other perspective than convenience for the user. But that is of course something that can be quite easily modified and fixed. There's lots of different spool holders that relocate it to the side of the machine, or I know a lot of people prefer to have their filament running out of a dry box or filament dryer of some sort. So even if these spool holders weren't on the backs of the printers, somebody would probably complain because it wouldn't be on the right side because it just wouldn't work for their setup. Fully acknowledge it's not the best design, but it also isn't that big of an issue. Like, as long as the printer is running nicely, I can forgive the spool holder being on the back. They are maybe a bit bulkier in design than they need to be. There's not like a ton of wasted extra space on the inside. I don't know, when I see the different printers in my workshop, they just maybe feel a little bulky. If I had to only keep one of them, then I would have to choose the X-Max 3 because being able to print at the largest possible scale that I can is just very useful when you are printing life-size props as frequently as I am. Yes, absolutely love my QIDI machines. They are still my go-to printers. They just suit the types of projects that I'm typically working on so well. And half of the time I have multiple ones going to help me produce different projects faster. I would not be able to pull off half of the stuff that I do without those printers. The QIDI printers, other than the size difference between them, really to me all have the same great print quality. They have very similar if not identical features, so it would really come down to the size of machine that you're looking at getting and what would best suit your needs. So while I feel like these machines are incredible, I do think that they are better suited towards somebody that has more experience with 3D printing, will really utilize the more advanced features that the machines have, especially for someone that uses a lot of those harder to print materials like ABS, ASA, nylon, just anything that really needs that enclosure. And also the bonus of having the active chamber heating. It means that you should never have an issue with flawless prints coming off of the build plate, regardless of what extreme type of filament you're choosing to use for your project. But moving on to the next category of printers, which is actually just one, and that is the Anycubic Cobra 2 Max. Now I would have to say this printer's biggest advantage also happens to be its biggest disadvantage, and that is just the sheer size of the thing. It is a 400 by 400 by 500, I believe, millimeter build volume. So this thing is absolutely massive. It's actually the largest 3D printer that I own. It's also a bed slinger style printer, which means it takes up even more space than that. In my workshop, this thing lives under my workbench on the floor because it's honestly just the best and safest place for it. When I first got this machine, I set it up on one of the workbenches in my main room. And I'd like to point out, it is a very sturdy table, but just the sheer size of this printer and it moving made the thing shake like crazy. So it is one of those things that you really have to keep in mind and consider, like, the proper setup for this printer. All that being said though, I do absolutely love this printer. It honestly has no business printing as well as it does given the size. Typically when you start looking at bigger machines, especially bed slingers, because of the added size of the build plate, the extra weight and vibration the machine is creating, there's just a higher possibility of more artifacts starting to show up on the prints themselves due to all of the extra vibration. But this thing produces some of the cleanest prints that I have ever seen from any of my machines. So obviously Anycubic really got their vibration compensation dialed in, because you would never know that the machine is as large as it is with the smoothness of these pieces. Of course, there's a lot of parts on K2 that are great examples of this, like a lot of cylinders and smooth surfaces that you would very easily be able to see any possible ringing and other artifacts of that nature on the prints themselves. But even all of the tauntaun pieces, they all looked super, super clean. Those horns were like defying gravity when I was printing them. I had them sticking straight up and they printed amazingly. The Max is of course the largest in the Cobra 2 line, so I can only imagine that the other Cobra 2 printers work similarly and can produce those quality prints. Having the ability to print at such a large scale is incredible. Even though this is not my most used machine, just because it is so large and it is also an open frame printer, which unfortunately goes my ability to easily print in ABS or any of the other materials unless I decided to try and create some sort of enclosure, which for my current setup, it just really wouldn't work out. And I'm honestly not even that disappointed in that. I have my enclosed printers that can print ABS, and I don't mind when some piece does come up in a project that I choose to want to print in one piece to save myself on post-processing. I can print it in PETG, still have a lot of those same post-processing benefits as ABS, and then be able to print it on my Cobra 2 Max. This printer was also very plug and play. Because of the bed slinger nature of it, there's a little bit of assembly, although it wasn't difficult. It was, to my memory, only basically attaching like the upper frame to the base of the printer. So it is quite beginner friendly. I'm not sure if a beginner would choose to purchase a 400mm printer as their first one. That being said, I would have probably been that person if 400mm printers existed when I started. Very easy automated process. It has the automatic bed leveling. It does have the automatic Z offset, but you can also modify it, which I appreciate greatly. I believe it still only has speed presets, which I wish were more customizable. There is an Anycubic slicer that did not work like at all. To be fair, it has been a while since I went to use it, but it again, I think, was a Prusa slicer reskin that had a lot of features missing. And beyond that, at the time when I was originally testing out this printer, just randomly half of the text that should have been part of the program just would not display for no apparent reason. Thankfully though, you could set up Prusa slicer to work with the Cobra 2 machines. There are some specific steps to get the Cobra 2 printers working with Prusa slicer, but there is also really clear documentation about how you do set that up correctly. But again, not the most beginner friendly thing there, especially because automatically I would say somebody would immediately just try and use Anycubic slicer, and if it has not improved, it's like a non-functioning slicer, and that's not going to help out anybody when it comes to printing. But the printer itself is excellent. It doesn't have a camera, but it does, I think, have a camera port. I don't actually know if Anycubic has ever come out with their own, and I have not tried plugging in a USB camera to the machine to see what it would do. I just set up one of my like usual Wi-Fi security type cameras in front of the printer so that I can monitor it when I'm not in the same room as it. So while the Cobra 2 Max isn't my most used 3D printer, just because I tend to reserve it for pieces that quite literally will not fit on any of my other machines, anytime that I do use it on a project, it's always a great experience, and I'm always very impressed and happy with the print quality. So if you're somebody that wants to buy an absolutely massive printer for their projects, then the Cobra 2 Max might be a great option for you. Also, most of these printers have their very own video on on my channel of when I initially was testing them out. So if there's one that you would like to hear more about, then I will link all of those videos in the description box as well, because I am trying to keep this video as concise as possible and really talk about the pros and cons that I still find for all of these printers now that I've been using them quite consistently since whenever I originally got them. Because despite maybe what it might sound like, I do actually still use all of these printers incredibly regularly in my work. Next up we have Creality, which we're going to be talking about the Ender 3 V3 KE and the Ender 3 V3, which for my own sanity I will be referring to from now on as either the KE or the V3. These are both part of the newest wave of Ender 3s. The lineup was the V3 SE, the V3 KE, and then the regular V3. Basically, the three of them were just upgraded versions of each other. It's classified as a Core XZ printer. I believe it's supposed to print faster than the KE. From my experience, both of them print excellently. Like, I've never had really any issues with either of them. Technically, the KE doesn't have vibration compensation, but I really haven't seen that show up on any of the prints. I did really soon after I got the KE switch the filament holder to the side so that it's actually a lot more similar to the V3, although I did also relocate the V3 spool to like the front side just to more slim down the profile of the machine. But this is again one of those things that I feel like no matter what a printer company does in terms of a spool holder, there will always be someone's setup that it just isn't practical for. Like, even with all of my older Ender 3s, it would be like the first thing that I did was print a new spool holder, because where I would keep them, I never had enough height for the spool to be mounted on the top. So I was always moving it to the side anyway. But I do think in the KE's case, relocating that spool to not have that extra weight on the top of the frame probably does save it a lot in terms of the possible vibrations that would start to show up on the machine. I honestly use both of these printers still weekly. They've turned into my new product producing printers. I've been designing and manufacturing custom art supply storage for years at this point, and I still have the business running, and I used to use various older Ender 3s to produce those products, and now I use the V3 and V3 KE as those product producing printers. And I will say, it is incredible being able to print something that would continuously take like 3 hours and 49 minutes or something to print, and now it takes an hour and 4 minutes. And I feel like that's a good testament also to the quality of these machines. They do still print really nicely. If they didn't, I would not be using them for product manufacturing. The printers themselves are great. They do lack that control that I wish I could have for the machines in terms of micro-stepping and being able to more specifically adjust certain settings like speed and things of that nature. I'm interrupting myself here really quick because I realized that on my V3, if you scroll down to the bottom here, there's this area called expert mode that does in fact have a Z offset section, which is amazing, except the fact that it does not actually save the adjustments that you make to this area. So you would have to redo this every single time you start a new print job, which is extremely frustrating. But the biggest problem that I ever had with these printers was the software. Creality Print, I know, has updated since I initially was testing it out with these printers. In my initial V3 video, I literally showed how the software itself was creating artifacts on my prints. And when I flipped to Orca Slicer, none of those issues were happening, which of course really sucks because the machines are great. The software should never be the thing that's causing problems like this to happen. But unfortunately, in these printers' cases, that is exactly what was happening. I obviously hope that those issues have been fixed, but since there were profiles available in Orca Slicer, I've never returned to Creality Print again. Only have so much mental space for so many slicers. Like most printers that I'm talking about in this video, it has a lot of the automatic controls, which are great for somebody starting out that you don't have to worry about them, but it can start to get frustrating when you want to have more control over some of those settings. The V3 in particular, I have been using a lot for product production, and it has automatic retract and extrude setting, you only have one button to press, and it drives me insane because if I just wanted to like clear out the hot end or switch filaments or something, I have to wait for the thing to finish extruding just a truly ungodly amount of filament from the nozzle. It just seems like way too much than it should be extruding. And I'm specifically pointing this out for the V3's case because how the machine is set up, you have a PTFE tube running from the side of the machine into the hot end, whereas for the KE, you just have the filament line. So for the KE, it's quite easy to open the extruder gear and pull the filament out as long as it hasn't expanded in the hot end. But for the V3, you are forced to run a retract or extrude to get that filament out of there because it is locked down. The V3 also has this like weird startup sequence where it goes up and down way more than it should and just wastes a lot of time. But these are honestly, in the grand scheme of things, quite small grievances and more just personal annoyances, especially since I am using 3D printers so frequently and using such a variety of them. I just notice these things a lot more. Despite me throwing these printers under the bus, I have them running like 4 to 5 days out of the week. The KE and V3 are definitely the best Ender 3s that I've ever owned, and I've technically, I think, owned like every iteration of them. I know that a lot of the older Ender 3s are still available to purchase today, and I honestly don't think you should ever buy an old Ender 3. There are honestly just so many beneficial upgrades on these newer machines to make them all that more beginner friendly that the slight price difference between the printers really I don't think is worth it. These newer Ender 3s have the automatic bed leveling, the way nicer build surface. Neither of these printers have the camera built in, but Creality does make the Nebula camera, which I also own one. It's a plug the USB into the front of the machine and it works type of camera. It's honestly a pretty great camera, like no complaints about it. It works. It gives you a live feed of your printer printing. I believe it's supposed to have various AI detection features. So yeah, it's a bonus accessory, but the plug and play nature of it is obviously a nice bonus if you are somebody starting out and want to have that camera feature as part of your printer. But with all that being said, which is going to kind of segue into our next part of the video, is I just happened to look up the price of the KE and the V3 because it's been a while and prices are always changing anyway. Like right now, all printers are on sale, which probably means they're coming out with new ones. So this video is probably going to be outdated in like 2 weeks time. But when I looked it up this morning, the price difference between the KE and V3 was $100. With the current sale, it had the KE at like 340 Canadian dollars, which I think is less than I bought my original Ender 3 for, which is insane considering all of the features that this machine has above what my original Ender 3 did. So that is an incredible price for a 3D printer when you're starting out. But the problem that I started to have was the V3 sale price currently puts it at the same price as the Bambu Lab A1 on sale. So while I think the V3 is a great printer, again mentioned I do use it multiple times a week, I do not see a world in which you pick an Ender 3 V3 over a Bambu Lab A1. Of course, this is currently right now where both machines are on sale. When they're at full price, hold on. Let me check that. Never mind, this is a non-existent argument because their normal prices are apparently the same too. I'm glad I was laying down when I saw this morning because for some reason I just did not think these printers were the same price. Which maybe at some point they weren't and then prices have been adjusted, but the argument still stands. I do not know why you would pick an Ender 3 V3 over a Bambu Lab A1, which we will be discussing in a moment. So while I did like the various changes between the KE and V3, it has a nice sleek design. The touchscreen feels a little more high-end. The extruder itself is supposed to be an improvement over what the KE is using. Thinking about what other 3D printers are at the exact same price range, I don't see why you would purchase an Ender 3 V3. So while I think both of them are really decent printers, when you start to factor in what you could purchase for the exact same price as the V3, the KE starts to look a lot more appealing. Especially right now, it's like 340 Canadian dollars. Even better, the SE is 230 Canadian dollars, which is absolutely insane. Never personally tried that. I'm sure you can look into the differences. Again, it's like an upgrade structure between the three. So like the SE might be where it's at, especially if you're not wanting to invest a lot in a 3D printer. Not that $230 isn't a lot of money, but you know, it's almost half of the price of the V3 and the A1. I'm having to butt in again because right after I filmed this video, this decided to happen, which I can only assume was because the printer overheard me and decided to rebel. And the blob isn't even the main issue. The issue was going to Creality's website and seeing what the replacement parts section looked like. I even switched it to the American website because I figured we might have more of a chance of resolving this issue. If we go up here to the accessories area, which is where the spare parts are supposed to be, these are definitely more along accessories, but you know, just let's see. So compatibility, nice that they have things listed by printer. I'm going to select the printer that is currently out of commission. And these are the options that we have for what is supposed to be spare parts. Is that how they phrase this? Yes, spare parts. Now, do you see anything on this list that is going to fix the issue that is currently going on with my printer? No. I'm glad they have the nozzles. There's a step in the right direction, I suppose. This printer is not particularly new. It is not quite a year old yet, but I believe I got it in February, March, so we've had a minute to resolve this possible issue. So if we go here to the KE, which has been, I believe, out a little longer, a lot of the same accessories, which makes sense. It is a very similar style printer, so a lot of the beds and stuff will work for both. And I am glad to see that here we start to actually have some replacement parts. Like a hot end. But just for comparison's sake, here is what QIDI's website looks like for the replacement and spare parts section. This is specifically for the X Max 3, although a lot of these will work for, you can see, the X Plus, X Smart. This is what I'm expecting when I go to a spare parts section. Actually, the parts that there's a chance something could happen to them and you might need to replace them so that your machine isn't eternally doomed. We're gonna go to Anycubic. Again, a very similar section. There are actually parts here that would resolve various issues that you hopefully will not have with your machine, but good to know that if there was an issue, you could fix it. A lot better looking than the Creality situation. And the king of them all in terms of spare parts, which we gotta go into the store here for a second. The spare parts section for Bambu Lab is one of the best that I have ever seen, and I was actually going to mention this in the Bambu section. You can pretty much replace any part that you would need to other than like the frame of the printer itself. But you can see just the extensive breakdown of spare parts here for the one printer, like literally the tool head block, like the back of the hot end, not even just the hot end, like the back plastic casing, just literally every single part. So from a Creality standpoint, especially for the printer that, again, as I mentioned, completely out of commission, there would be no hope for me looking at Creality's website of me fixing my machine. It would be like unsolvable. And I would also like to point out from this, I had no clue what hot end that printer had. I had to guess and order one because all of these blasted printers have such a similar name. Like, trying to search what hot end this machine actually has does not help at all. Like, you can see the SE hot end pops up, the KE hot end pops up, but do you think the normal V3 hot end pops up on, like, anything for me to ever even have a hope of figuring out what that printer uses? No. Which I blindly guessed. It has the same tool head in appearance as the K1C, and they came out at about the same time. And reading the vague breakdown of this printer, which this does in appearance look like what the Ender 3 V3 has, except The first one that I ordered had these smaller copper wires, which there's absolutely no way that that is fitting on the board that is in the hot end. The second one that I ordered, that for all intents and purposes should have been the exact same hot end as this with the small wires, had the longer ones. That's actually not right. The way that I could not even find a picture of this blasted hot end, this is from a random Amazon review. So I randomly found this other, it is supposed to be the exact same K1C hot end, but as you can see here, it has this additional wiring on the end of the copper lines. So I don't know if this is what the K1Cs have now. I have no clue what the hot end, the Ender 3 V3 actually is supposed to have, but it is similar enough to this that I believe it's going to work. But I still have not actually fixed the machine yet because I'm furious at it. It should not be this difficult to replace a part that can very easily be damaged. Like, it should not be this much of a struggle to fix a part that is one that, of all of these types of pieces that you see here, the hot end is the one that has the greatest chance of needing to be replaced due to some unfortunate thing happening to the print job that messes it up, blah, 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 whatever. And like, technically, I still don't actually know if this is 100% going to work. I believe it's going to work because it does look the exact same. It has the same connections. I still can neither confirm nor deny if my educated guess is actually going to work out, and that is honestly pretty unacceptable when you have other companies with this many spare parts to replace every single one, and it's not even brand specific. It is like a standard thing that you should be able to replace all of these different pieces on your machine, and if one thing goes down, it isn't completely dooming the entire printer to never be able to be usable again. And that brings us to our last category of printers, which is of course Bambu Lab. I've had the great pleasure in being able to use the A1 combo as well as the X1 carbon, and if you've spent any amount of time on the 3D printing side of the internet, then I'm sure you've already heard all of the wonderful things about Bambu Lab printers, and they really are all true. In my opinion, they are leagues ahead of everyone else in terms of the jump from somebody that has never used a 3D printer before to being able to start and successfully use one. Their entire ecosystem really does make it easy to jump into the hobby, and it does also make it really exciting to do so as well. They're just really fun printers to use. There's lots of like flashy fun stuff that you can do with them, especially with the ability to multicolor print. Multicolor printing might not be everyone's cup of tea, and I do just want to say that the machines on their own outside of the AMSs and multicolor printing abilities are also both excellent. I know a lot of people get caught up on the multicolor printing aspect of things, but I did make it a point to extensively test out both machines with just one filament color, see what the quality and setup and user experience was like for those, and both of them produce some of the cleanest 3D prints that I get out of my workshop. The A1 has the ability to print in 4 different colors at a time, and the X1 Carbon has the ability to connect up to 4 AMS units to print up to 16 colors. Now, something I did mention in my initial A1 video was that the AMS Lite apparently could switch out the filament colors faster than the normal AMS with the X1 Carbon, P1S, all of those ones that use the normal AMS units. But I could never find like a record online of exactly how long the X1 Carbon and AMS printers took compared to the A1 and AMS Lite. But now that I own both, I can actually answer this question for you. Now, these times are up for a bit of variation depending on the amount of material the machine needs to purge. If you're going from very drastic color changes, like from black to white, then the machine calculates a lot more needed purged material, which of course takes longer. The A1 can switch filament colors at about a minute. It's like a minute to a minute and 15 seconds was about where it was averaging, whereas the X1 Carbon takes about a minute and 40 seconds, which isn't a huge time difference, but when you consider that you could be working on a multicolor print that has 800 and some odd filament changes, then that time really starts to add up. Which, if you had a print job with 800 filament changes, you would be looking at 5 additional extra hours of print time. Both of these printers are a ton of fun to use. There's really nothing incredibly bad that I can say about either of them, because the machines themselves, like, pretty much have no problems, but they have a lot of the same things, like I have brought up multiple times in this video, which is the lack of control as the user, especially again if you are more experienced. I wish you could, especially on the X1 Carbon, considering just the capabilities that that printer has with it being enclosed, and I would say also probably more marketed towards somebody that's more experienced in 3D printing. I wish there would just be like a little switch you could flick in one of the settings that would turn it on to advanced mode, and you would be able to have a lot more specific control with some of the settings. Also, for the X1 Carbon, it doesn't have that active chamber heating like the QIDI printers do, but as of right now, it's never been an issue for me. I do think it helps that the machine isn't as large as like the X Max or X Plus, where there could be the potential of some cold spots in the enclosure just given the larger size of the machines. But the X1 Carbon seems to be capable of keeping the enclosure temperature at around 45 degrees Celsius without any issue. So far has been a perfectly fine temperature for any of the prints that I've done on it using ABS or ASA. I am still a bit paranoid about it though, just because I have come from having that active chamber heating for so long. But like I said, so far so good, and that could just be me being paranoid. Another downside, I guess you could say, about these printers is they actually have the exact same build volume. Bambu Lab only make 2 different size machines, and it's like 5 of them are the one size and then 1 of them is the other. So you don't have the variety in size options like you do for a lot of other printer brands. I'm sure that's something that they're going to be changing in the future, but right now the majority of the 3D printers, and also the largest 3D printers that they make, are the 256 millimeters cubed, which is a size that's a bit situated between like a small and medium class printer. It's a really decent size. I can fit, again, the majority of pieces that I'm looking at printing on it, but you're not going to be fitting that full-size helmet on these printers. I did have a note about another possible downside for these machines being the price, but at least in the A1's case, that argument sort of goes out the window when you can apparently buy an Ender 3 for the same price these days. For the X1 Carbon though, if I was looking for something to be my go-to 3D printer that I was really only concerned about printing in one filament color, probably those harder to print filaments like ABS or ASA, the X1 Carbon on its own is still $400 more than the QIDI X Max 3, which is the larger printer that also has active chamber heating. The X Plus 3, which is still larger than the X1 Carbon, is basically half of the price. They do both still have their pros and cons though. Like if you are looking for the absolute easiest possible printer to use, then the X1 Carbon probably wins there. If you are looking for more precise control and the ability to print larger, then the QIDI ones win. The X1 Carbon though, of course, still has that capability of being able to multicolor print or multi-filament print, which especially in the X1 Carbon's case, I could see coming in very handy, especially with some of those more intense filaments. Being able to print your piece in the, you know, carbon fiber, nylon or whatever, but then print the supports in something that is more easily removed from the piece, because I can't imagine carbon fiber support material being easy to remove. If you are working on projects that really need the ability to print supports in a different material, then the X1 Carbon is of course going to be your better choice here. Either way, they're all excellent printers. Switching back to the A1 for a minute, I do think hands down of all of the 3D printers that I have tried this year, the A1 is still winning as the most beginner friendly printer. And it does really come down to the software side of things and ecosystem that Bambu Lab has created. I mean, you can literally find a model on Bambu Lab's Maker World model website, press print on your phone, and have the printer automatically start printing that model. I mean, that does also work with the X1 Carbon, and the X1 Carbon is equally easy to use as the A1. It just has a lot of additional capabilities and features that I don't think somebody starting out with 3D printing would necessarily necessarily utilize. So if I were to rank all of these 3D printers, and keep in mind, this is just coming from my own personal preferences and what I'm typically using these machines for in my work. Number one would still have to be my QIDI trio of printers. They really just suit my work so well and what I'm typically using 3D printers for. It gives me the ability to print these massive pieces, especially on the X Max 3, in harder to print with material like ABS or ASA. They all print ABS incredibly well though, and I'm never concerned about possible delamination of the pieces thanks to that active chamber heating. Next up would have to be the Bambu Lab printers. I do love the A1 and X1C so much, and they are just so fun to use. Really, the one reason that puts them in second place for me is really just down to that build volume size. If they made an X1 carbon style printer with the active chamber heating and also at maybe a 400mm cubed build volume, then I think without a doubt that machine would be at the top of my list. I think the Bambu Lab printers in a lot of people's cases would be their ideal printer thanks to just how easy they are to use, and not only the ease of use, but the fact that their print quality is amongst some of the best on the market right now. And of course, the ability to multicolor and multi-material print is something unlike any of the other printers on this list. In third place, we have the Anycubic Cobra 2 Max. Very few printers can beat the build volume on that machine, and I'm not sure if any of those would ever be able to print at a higher quality than that one does. The prints are beautiful. I love the ability to be able to print such large pieces in one piece. It saves me a lot on post-processing, even if I can only print in PLA or PETG. Not having to deal with assembling and the seams on multiple parts saves me more time than printing in an easier to post-process material like ABS ever could. And unfortunately, this time around, in last place, we have Creality. And that's not because the Ender 3 V3 and KE are bad printers, it's just kind of because there's nothing extraordinary about them. They still produce great prints, I still use them all of the time. There's just nothing super special about them that makes me want to go out of my way to use those machines over other ones that I have in my workshop. Obviously, this was not every 3D printer on the market today, and there are always new machines coming out. But I hope this was able to answer some of your questions about the printers that you see me use frequently on this channel, and also hopefully give you a better idea about some features and things that you should be keeping in mind when it comes to figuring out the best 3D printer for yourself. Of course, if you have questions about any of these machines or just in general about 3D printing, please feel free to leave those in the comments. But that is everything. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.